Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nathan. This is going to be a pretty interesting video. So I originally wanted to kind of give you an update on everything, but if you're paying attention to some recent news coverage around elections and infrastructure, there's been some breaking news, I would call it. So if you're not familiar with me and my background, my name is Nathan Taylor. I'm one of the 3 executive directors of the Election Trade Alliance. My specific background is in network security, technology, signal communications. I have a degree in network security. I've spent time as a 25 Bravo computer tech specialist with the Army Reserves, commissioned into the Army National Guard as a signal officer. So I've worked for a couple different companies at this point, civilian side to do, real-time network monitoring for banks and other industry, healthcare, just a little bit of everything. And I think it's really interesting because that is what led me to start looking into our elections, looking into the data with, help from Jive and all of the other ETA volunteers who joined us. And then actually looking into the infrastructure, which we were always very hesitant to talk about because it is pretty complex. And, although the data that we have made public now brings up concerns, it doesn't really tell us exactly how or what could create those effects. So we do have to be careful about, saying absolutely this is or is not, how you could do it. With all of that in mind, let's talk about what just happened. So if you're not familiar, just recently, I believe a day or two ago, I think a TikTok video went viral from Ashley St. Clair. I hope I'm saying her name right. I think that's right. And she was talking about her experiences with Elon Musk. If you're not familiar with who she is, I believe she is an ex of Elon Musk. I believe they've had a child together, and she was with him during the 2024 presidential election. Elon Musk made some statements to her in private or, during their text conversations or whatever it was, talking about, where he was going to unleash a anomaly in the matrix. And it was talking about like space lasers and all of this stuff, a piece on the chessboard that they won't see or something like that. So she just kind of gives her account. You can go watch her video. I believe it's on TikTok. I believe people have reposted it on YouTube. So you can just go look her up, Ashley St. Clair. Well, what's interesting here is she brings up the concerns that Elon was relaying to her information about election infrastructure, about his satellites. And she also talked about something interesting, which is during the election day, he seemed to have access to election data that seemed almost real time. And she raised that as a red flag and saying, well, how does he have access to that information? Could there be a concern here? Well, before we get into the tech, and I'll give you some personal information and then we'll go about it, let's listen to a few more statements here. So she just came out about this publicly. Says she's talking about it, says she may have receipts, etc. Well, is this the first time we've heard anything like this? And so here's a little video for you.
We can take the Senate pretty easily. And I think with our little secret, we're going to do really well with the House, right? Our little secret is having a big impact. He and I have a secret. We'll tell you what it is when the race is over.
Computers are the greatest. He looked at some that were just shipped in, some of these vote counting computers. He knew it before it even came in the door. He looked like at the back of it. Oh, I know that one.
I'm a technologist. I know a lot about computers. And I'm like, the last thing I would do is trust a computer program. Because it's just too easy to hack. It's too easy to add just one line.
Yeah, we're in SpaceX and quietly just do whatever we want.
Sure. And I have one more quote as well here. This one was, so a lot of those quotes were before the election, leading up to the election. This one is specifically right after, before inauguration.
Journey to Pennsylvania, where he spent like a month and a half campaigning for me in Pennsylvania. And he's a popular guy, and he was very effective. And he knows those computers better than anybody, all those computers, those vote counting computers. And we ended up winning Pennsylvania like in a landslide. So it was pretty good. It was pretty good. So thank you to Elon. And
so a couple key things there. Well, first, don't forget to, like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. Help out the social media team. But I'll keep it big picture for this. What were some of the takeaways from those statements? So we had a couple different statements about we don't need votes. We don't need you to vote. We don't care about voting. A couple statements about a little secret for taking the House, and maybe even suggesting, influences on the Senate as well, leading up to the election. And then multiple statements about vote counting computers, which is language you don't traditionally hear. Elon Musk knows those vote counting computers, and we won Pennsylvania like in a landslide. So these are all quotes that we've put up before, but having looked at, this recent news, those quotes seem to carry a little bit more weight. Let's ask that question then. It would be impossible to use satellites to mess with our election infrastructure. Right. Starlink provides both internet, and Starlink now has direct-to-cell services where you can use smartphones to talk to the satellites and get internet, which is important because you ask the question, if I have a cellular modem in something like my cell phone, is it connected to the internet even if it's not physically plugged in? Yes, absolutely. If you have cellular connection, you can access the internet. So Starlink has this capability and has had this capability for a while now, direct to cell. With that in mind, if I could leverage a satellite with a cellular modem capability, or being able to communicate with cellular modems, our systems aren't connected to the internet, right? And it's impossible. But here we are finding out that cellular modems have been detected for multiple years now in some of the leading voting infrastructure used across the U.S. At least 60 to 70% of the U.S. uses these 2 to 3 major brands. And these major brands, their most leading voting systems, their vote counting computers, their tabulators at the precinct levels, have been found to come with cellular modems. Many places will actually use these cellular modems to upload results. I believe this is a thing in Minnesota. Pennsylvania says they don't do this. They say that they don't authorize the use of these modems and that they shouldn't have modems in their machines. But we're yet to get the documentation that shows that they actually said they removed them and they're not just deactivated, because deactivating them, there may be other vulnerabilities. Just because you could talk to these systems, it doesn't mean that, it happened. It doesn't mean that they're online or anything like that, right? Well, here's the fun part as well. Election systems and software, which is what's used in Pennsylvania, by the way, used across most of the swing states. A lot of these voting systems in 2020, in 2021, I believe, and going back to even 2018, that the systems we're still using today, by the way, have been reported to have remote access software in them, installed and configured and accessible, that could be accessed through cellular modems, via cellular modems. And yet we're finding out that these systems, I believe it's been documented at this point in 2020, 2021, where at least 35 different voting systems were connected to the internet and were accessible by ES&S across 11 different states. That's like management systems. That's the county level or worse. Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan. And across those 11 states, 14,000 tabulators were found to have online modems in them. And that's the DS200s, which are used pretty heavily across the U.S. still. So it really brings up the question then, if I have the means to connect to these systems using cellular modems, which some of these systems have, or some of these systems are connected to the internet at the county level, the election management systems, which is what you send the data to, or you upload the data to using USB devices. Even then, right, the software should be secure. It's certified, it's tested. There are no vulnerabilities to exploit except for, that remote management access, which was discovered, right? And yet here we are with our findings in Pennsylvania and our lawsuit there. This is something we're now making public, where the most recent software, the core version used during the 2024 election, is based upon this software version that New York State has found has at least 420 vulnerabilities. They actually flagged more than that, but they've confirmed at least 420 vulnerabilities to the core software. And this was in, I believe, 2023. And I'm quoting what they flagged about would allow you to manipulate the counting and the storing of votes. This is a big deal. You could escalate privileges. You could change things. And that kind of concludes the pieces and the concerns about Starlink. As we said, hypothetically, if you did have the means to use satellites that had cellular capabilities to remotely access or upload malware to tabulation systems or election management systems that may or may not be connected to the internet across the US, then yes, theoretically, you could exploit these vulnerabilities and change votes. That's possible. Theoretically possible. Obviously, it would require a lot of capability to do so, but it would be possible. Now, what about those other places that aren't connected to the internet? And what about the audits that we do that would catch this, right? We hand count, we double check, we certify the systems, we test them. Well, here's a little snippet for you. If you're somewhat familiar with Volkswagen, I like to use this as a representation for how audits are not foolproof. Early 2015, I believe, is when it went public, where Volkswagen had designed in their systems a software defeat to emissions auditing, where they would test the systems, the machines, the cars, right? They would test the systems, and they would function normally during testing. How did they catch this, right? Well, so a nonprofit actually was looking at the emissions data. They flagged that the data wasn't making sense. The math wasn't matching. It wasn't mathing, right? And so what did they say? They said, well, we don't trust the audits. We don't trust the way we're currently checking the system. Let's test the machines while they're in use. Let's test them in the highway. That's what they did. They put on they attached a device onto the Volkswagen that actively monitored the emissions attached to the tailpipe, and they drove it on the highway. And then they found out that their audits were being defeated using that data and using the test, right? They did an independent audit. They did a independent test. So I flag all of that for you because that is the same thing the ETA wants to do right now. We are concerned that the current audits we use are not sufficient to catch this type of vote manipulation. And the best way to determine and verify is to do an independent audit. Review by hand the most anomalous precincts in some of these places that have a strong chain of custody and determine then, does the digital reports match the physical ballots? And chain of custody is the most important thing, because if you can't guarantee that the ballots haven't been messed with since the election, then you don't know. So that's important, is you want places that have sealed the ballots and they've been locked away, like Pennsylvania. That's why our legal action in Pennsylvania is so important. So with that in mind, if we trust the audits, two other final flags is, when I've spent some time working for a managed security company that did SOC operations for banks, they did penetration testing, they did audits. The most important thing you learn is banks hire independent third parties to do audits of their systems. You don't audit yourself. Why? For example, the county, right? The county's doing their own audit. They're checking their own systems. They're counting their own votes afterwards. The problem is it's a conflict of interest. Even if you did everything right, any problems you find, you're probably going to fix them or cover them up because it makes you look bad, even if you did everything right. And that is the issue we're flagging, is our current audits don't take into account human error or human problems. We trust that everything is done by the book. There's no conflict of interest. When really the state should be doing independent audits, which is what we're wanting to do, right? Is we want to independently bring people in who weren't involved in the election to validate and to verify. That's important. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the other piece, right? Which is these systems, many places like Pennsylvania, they don't use cellular modems to upload their data anyways. Their systems theoretically aren't connected to the internet. So you couldn't mess with them using satellites or anything like that. Well, there's other means to mess with systems. And this is what's important, is with enough means, you can compromise anything. If you're familiar, Stuxnet is an example of this. If you're not familiar, Stuxnet it's pretty much what a lot of cybersecurity experts dub the first cyber weapon, right? The first widespread malware. Specifically, it seemed to have been a software or malware designed by maybe the US and Israel to go after Iran nuclear programs. How interesting. It actually propagated onto an air-gapped system, destroyed the centrifuges that were used to enrich uranium for their nuclear program, and then it actually managed to infect the internet. But it was so specifically designed where it only went after software that was directly involved with the nuclear program stuff. Not being connected to the internet. And how did they do it? And the theory is, and this is why Stuxnet is so interesting, is it's completely applicable to today. If I have voting systems that are never connected to the internet during operation, well, then how could I introduce malware onto them? And Stuxnet was a solution for the Iranian nuclear program because their systems were never connected to the internet. They had people inside the nuclear program that were able to get their hands on media devices that had this malware on it, whether that hidden in furniture or snuck in other ways. But they somehow snuck this malware in, and then it breached the air gap by physical connecting to the systems locally. So could you do the same thing with enough know-how and means to, could you compromise our election infrastructure? Absolutely. You have to understand that all the voting systems that aren't connected to the internet, how are you uploading the data from those tabulators to the county? How are you transferring that? Well, you use a USB device or a media device. And so you have to understand then these systems are updated prior to the election. They're plugged in at some point, or they're given software updates by USB. So at some point they are connected to the internet before the election, and then they're taken off, air-gapped. But then you still have to copy the data from the machines through USB. There's been no examples of this, right? We check the software that goes on our USB devices, right? We make sure those USB devices are clean, right? Well, no. This has been another big issue. So this is actually dated for 2021. This was a big deal because there were documented issues in 2020 where the EAC investigated a problem with ES&S. They found problems with their USB devices. The documents showed that, so Texas voting machine examiners found a ES&S uncertified USB stick that was used to install software updates for some of these voting systems used across the state. And when they found that USB stick, the software installed didn't match the certified software. It failed the security check. This was a big deal where they found that the software wasn't matching what should have been on it. There was an investigation, and the documents suggested that this investigation scaled up to 19 states that were vulnerable to this potentially malicious software or USB device compromise that you could do. There were other problems where ES&S, I think, had issues with the way their certification and their hashing checks were done. And ultimately, the issue and the investigation were never reported or referenced publicly. I believe it might be more public now. This is a vulnerability that has not been really addressed currently. This is still a problem. How are we checking that the USB devices we are using to upload or take data from these machines that aren't connected to the internet is actually secure and hasn't put, malware hasn't been put on it? This is why this kind of brings it all together. Is we talked about, modems, we talked about, compromise with malware. Well, in our lawsuit, we bring up those concerns. The data that we've published at this point for Pennsylvania and other places. Remember, Pennsylvania, he knows those vote counting computers. Well, we flagged that the data, the machines had problems in Pennsylvania. For example, Cambria County, they had a logic and accuracy testing, a document that doesn't seem to be legitimate. And some of their own emails say that they didn't do some of the testing that their document says they did. This is a concern, right? Because you're trusting the counties to follow the rules, to do the audits, to verify before the election, and to hand count, a small sample after the election. But you're relying on the county to do this, and you need to spot check. You need to make sure. You need to verify. And that's what our lawsuit is saying, is we're saying there's so many problems around what happened with the 2024 election in Cambria, Erie, and Allegheny, where some of the machines stopped working, by the way. Cambria County, all of their machines couldn't scan the ballots during the election day until later. On top of that, we had, mismatching reports, and the data when we ran it using peer-reviewed election forensic methods, used to look at Russian elections, experts. Yes, instead of, humans voting, it almost seemed like a machine based on a preset formula was deciding the votes. And the red flag. So we bring all this up because we want audits in Pennsylvania. We want the judge to compel hand count audits in some of these places. And we flagged the vulnerabilities of these systems that we're still using today that could be exploitable and could have been exploited during the 2024 election. And they will be exploitable for the midterms. So to summarize the concern, we'll kind of close out there. Don't forget, like, subscribe to the video, and we'll be publishing more about the systems and the infrastructure at scale. But the takeaway is very simple. At the beginning, we talked about Ashley St. Clair and the concerns that Elon Musk had made statements about Starlink or satellites. And yes, absolutely, there are concerns. If you had the means to utilize satellites to talk to cellular modems, you could introduce malware. You could exploit vulnerabilities. And that is capable. That is possibility. The distinction is there is not yet evidence that is what happened. That's why we want investigations into the original paper ballots, into the vulnerabilities around the systems, because realistically speaking, if I could introduce malware, there would be no evidence. The malware would self-destruct on the way out or when you close or reboot the system or anything. So really, it just brings up the question, how can we do better going forward? How can we fix these vulnerabilities? How can we not use cellular modems in our machines? How can we make sure our election infrastructure isn't accessible to the internet? And how can we double check so that the paper matches the digital reports? And that is all stuff we are working towards here at the Election Truth Alliance. As we go forward, we're pushing into our Pennsylvania lawsuit, as you know. There are some other pieces in the background for that, but we're trying to push that along. At this point, we're waiting on the judge's decision on how things will continue. But all of these things and these findings, they do bring up further concerns, and not just Pennsylvania, across the U.S., especially as we get closer to the next major election. So thank you guys very much for listening. If you want to support the ETA, we're going to put out an update very shortly. We actually put out a newsletter talking about kind of where we are at, fundraising, what we've spent our money on in the past, what projects we're still working on, what does that look like. So we'll have an update for you. If you want to get involved in what we're doing as we lead up to the next major election, if you got backgrounds in cybersecurity, IT, data forensics analysis, all of this stuff, or social media, and you want to help spread the word about our findings and our concerns and better our election infrastructure as we go forward, go to electiontruthalliance.org, volunteer. Thank you guys very much. As I like to say, be safe, prepare, take care of your family, but don't forget to be involved in your local elections. Vote, be engaged, because I think now it's more important than ever to be engaged as we go forward. So thank you guys very much. Oh, yeah, we got a little outro. Yeah, there we go. Like and subscribe. Thank you guys.